Well, happy darn CultureCast Day, everybody. And Earth Day plus one day. Let's welcome my new friend, Dan Duster, who I'm super excited to have on CultureCast. Welcome, Dan. How are you?
I am wonderful, and enjoying the music. I was bouncing around. I see what you mean. That
You
music
know,
that's nice.
right? I have to shout out, I do this every time. A family friend and talented producer, his name is Julius Wilder. He's here in Nashville, threw that together. And I mean, I don't say that lightly because he gets the vibe of what we're trying to create. I think to remind everybody, the reason why I love chatting with industry leaders from across industries, it's about how do we help create communities and cultures where everyone can thrive. And every time I have the chance to interview someone or just visit and chat, it's just really good energy. And so I think what Julius captured is the energy level of what's happening in these conversations. So thank you, Julius. And thank you, Dan. So Dan, where are you today? Where are you sitting from? And who is that lovely portrait behind you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm in Chicago, actually in the city on the South Side,
Right
visiting
on.
the home office, and the portrait is of my great grandmother, Ida B. Wells Barnett.
I love it. And actually, Dan, people may have connected the dots, although you and I were doing this backstage, on maybe how you and I got to know each other. Dan is the descendant, as you all see, of Ida B. Wells Barnett. And he also attended this amazing gathering of descendants of civil rights leaders in the US. And we all came together and had some pretty epic moments together, whether it was at the White House with Kamala, that amazing tour of the US Capitol. I recall like hanging with you and your sister for our private tour at the Smithsonian. And then, like, I'm just going to jump into it. And we had a fabulous dinner with the RFK Center for Human Rights. So, Carrie Kennedy and her board and the leaders. And Dan, you got up and just made a pretty epic speech. So, I'm going to just start there and let's talk about, your experience in Washington, D.C., what you recall from it. I know a lot of people want to understand through my eyes, but I think more importantly, like you as one of the descendants, right? Like, what was your
Mhm.
experience? Let's
The
talk about
experience
that.
it was incredible. And as I shared that night, I've got an uncle who used to say, "Oh, I spent about 7 days there one weekend." Um, So we were there for 2 days, but it felt like 7 or 8 days, and truly either meeting or reconnecting with old friends. As I shared with you, during the pre-game here, it
Yeah.
was awesome. It was awesome to be with descendants of such greatness, and everybody was just cool. They were humble, good people, and so that was incredible. But yeah, I mean, going to the White House, and that was my second time going. My
Yeah.
sister and I went for the signing of the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill back in 22. But still an incredible experience, and like I said, to be around the people and to get the private tours that we did. So again, big shout out to you and Joshua and Kenneth for facilitating that happening. Is we had VIP status for 48 hours. It was absolutely amazing.
Well, you mean you always have VIP status, and you also happen to have that in Washington, D.C. Let's not forget that. And yeah, amazing. I agree with you. I think, people have an idea. I think they even romanticize it a little bit in their minds about, well, what was that all about? And, I agree with you. I think people were good people, chill, very cool and humble, and really just open, like to get to know each other if they didn't already, as you said, new friends, old friends, and reconnecting with people. And I thought that was very cool. And I remember when you mentioned, and Michelle mentioned that you had been back to the White House in 2022 for the anti-lynching bill. Pretty phenomenal. I think you were there too. We were all chilling with Reverend Wheeler Parker, who, is the cousin of Emmett Till's. And so pretty wild hanging out there too and getting stories from him firsthand. But let's talk about you and let's talk about how badass for a minute your great grandmother is. Let's talk about her. Why should people know Ms. Ida B. Wells Barnett? Why should they know her?
Um, so she's honestly one of the most prolific and impactful leaders, especially of the civil rights movement in American history, period. And I say that America tries to encapsulate the civil rights movement from 1954 to
Yeah,
1968, but it went way before there and still going on right now.
that's right.
So, right. So her time frame, she was born in Mississippi in 1862, so born into slavery. But during Reconstruction, so her parents were both active members in the community and voted. So I mean, yeah, I'll say 3 minutes on her.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of course.
I could spend hours. But being born during Reconstruction, she grew up having rights, equal rights that white people had.
Yeah.
And so then, for those rights to be gradually taken away, between the Jim Crow laws and then the actual discriminatory laws, once you have it taken away, I think that that's more impactful, more angering than never having it at all. And so the major things that she's known for are the anti-lynching crusade, but she did some other phenomenal things that were well ahead of her time. She initiated, so I guess in order, she was on a rail car in Tennessee and was
Mhm.
forcibly removed. She was in a ladies' car, and the conductor told her she needed to go to the smoking car, which was the black car. And
Okay.
ladies' car was the equivalent of a first class ticket. And she's like,
Yeah.
no, this is ladies' car. I'm a lady. And Ida was a very distinguished woman, as you can see in the picture. That was,
Absolutely.
average attire for her. So she sued after being forcibly removed. She sued the Tennessee Railroad and won. And unfortunately, that was later overturned, which again fueled her anger
Mhm.
and passion for justice. Um, she was a school teacher. She wrote about the disparity between the school systems, and this is in Memphis. Unfortunately, you could take that article and it applies to more of a percentage of schools than we care to right now. But talks about white schools versus black schools, and the white schools had adequate funding, proper class sizes, and adequate resources, and blacks were overcrowded, underfunded, and under
Mhm.
resourced. So she didn't get fired, but she did not have her contract renewed that following semester. So that forced her into, which she was already in the transition to being a journalist, but that forced her into doing that for revenue. Then she had three friends who were lynched in Memphis in 1892. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, Will Stewart. She
Mhm.
was so close to Thomas, she was actually godmother to his child and was away when it happened. But in coming back to Memphis and then reading the newspapers, they were essentially labeled thugs that were troublemakers, and they were actually just defending that they were co-owners in a store, a co-op called the People's Grocery, and they defended themselves. It was a short story, but they were lynched really, and this is
Mm.
really for being economically successful, and that's what Ida's realization was like. Wow, if they're saying this about these three men, and I know they're upstanding men in the community, and this is clearly about economic suppression, is that if you can't control somebody legally, you can kind of control them economically and mentally.
Yeah.
And lynching was the way to do that through terror, which lynching was clearly, in my opinion, America's first form of domestic terrorism. And so that initiated her crusade against lynching. She did a bus boycott, not a bus. They had a rail car system in Memphis. She boycotted that for 5 to 7 months, which was very effective. She traveled to Europe to bring light to what America was doing to the Negro, and it tried to initiate boycotts against the U.S. Against Great Britain to boycott the U.S. For importing cotton. Met with President McKinley in 1898 with some other people, not just her,
Yeah.
to make lynching a federal crime, which it never was until 2022, so almost
Right.
125 years later. So she was just so far ahead of her time as far as standing up for rights and the manner in which she did it. Again, to initiate boycotts, to demand that she be in the ladies' car, which is a first class seat. Um, one of the founders of the NAACP somewhat distanced herself from there because they weren't, in her opinion, adamant or aggressive enough about the anti-lynching crusade. spoke out against the government at the risk of her going to jail, and didn't. Her life was threatened, having published documents about the lynchings that took place. So, and during her time frame, lynchings went from 200 plus per year to, um, dramatically reduced, so almost non-existent. The challenge with lynching
Wow.
and documenting it is the how do you classify lynching? Is that lynching
Yeah.
is technically mob action, including killing somebody without the legal system. So there have been plenty of blacks who were killed. When you look at Tulsa, that was a massacre, but that was not considered lynching. So, um,
Interesting.
mhm.
Wow. I mean, you're right. We can go on about Ida. She is OG and legend, and I love the couple of quotes that are out there. Everyone when they quote her, and you're describing her life in these quotes, which I love. The two quotes is somebody must show that the African American race is more sinned against than sinning, and it seems to have fallen upon me to do so. And the other one, which I love, and this is kind of encapsulates everything that you just said, I felt that one had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. And I love that it was about making every effort and not standing down. I think about the story you told about her being in the ladies' car, right? And then being asked to move. She's like, nope, I've got a ladies' ticket, right? And then going back and fighting against that. But it's not just about her, it's about creating equity. And that's what I love what she stands for. And the fact that, having been born into slavery, but then becoming a teacher and a journalist and becoming an OG civil rights leader and creating this American history, right not too far away from where we are right now. I'm sitting in Nashville. Memphis is just a couple of hours drive. It's wild how much of American history has just happened right down there, and not just music. It goes all the way back to what's
Mhm.
happened in our history. So I feel super fortunate to have met you and to call you a new friend, and just to see this goodness really come through for you. I mean, I know we just talked a few minutes about your great grandmother, but let's talk about you. Like, I'd love to get into, all right, you're in Chicago. Would love to know who young Dan was. And when did you figure out that your great grandmother was an OG civil rights leader? Like, how did that all happen for you and in growing up?
Sure. So yeah, young Dan. I'm actually back in the house that I grew up in. I'm blessed. I grew up in a unique neighborhood where we all knew each other, had the phone numbers for each and everybody on the block. Um, got in trouble for riding our bikes the wrong way down Stony Island, which is a major thoroughfare. Speed limit is supposed to be 30, but people will go 50, 60.
Uh-oh.
Our parents found out about it before we got back home because Mrs. Russell saw us and went and called each and every parent and said, I saw them on Stony Island. Um, so I'd say my family neighborhood shaped me definitely more as a young person than Ida B. Wells. Like I said, so the neighborhood, we wanted to do bad stuff, but we couldn't because we had neighborhood accountability, right? Um, and being a duster, which is so the lineage for Ida is that so she married Ferdinand Barnett, who was a phenomenal civil rights attorney,
Hmm.
African American civil rights attorney in Chicago. He had two children already. He was a widower. His wife, who was an African American woman, one of the first females who went to Michigan, African American females who went to Michigan, and he wanted a strong black woman. So when Ida visited Chicago to boycott the World's Fair, 1893, he met her. He's like, "Yes, you're going to be Mrs. Barnett." So
Oh,
he had to court her for a while, and it was Wells Barnett. So
yeah.
he didn't drop her name. And he was the owner of the Conservator newspaper, Chicago's first black newspaper. And she allegedly negotiated ownership of the newspaper for her hand in marriage. So she was actually an entrepreneur and a businesswoman as well, which a
I
lot of people
love
don't
that.
realize. But yeah, so they had four children together. The youngest one being Alfreda, and Ida had Alfreda when she was almost 42 years old, which was very rare back
Oh,
then.
wow.
So I'm just happy about Ida in so many different ways. Like I said, that's thanks again, Ida, for having a child later in life. Alfreda married a guy by the name of Ben Duster, who, quick story on that. Ben Duster, Ida's child, Herman Barnett, went to University of Illinois, and one of the founding members for Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity on that campus. Um, Herman brought Ben back to Chicago, and they worked with his dad, Ferdinand, and Ben took a liking to uh, Herman's younger sister, Alfreda, which, any guys out there, college guys, know you don't want your college buddy talking to your younger sister.
Nope.
So fortunately, Ben was bold enough to do it, and they got married and had children. And so that's Alfreda had 5 children, one of them being Donald. Donald had 3 children, one of them being Dan. But all of my dad's generation in Chicago, you could only go to a handful of high schools. Being a black person, right? Again,
Yeah.
Chicago still was and is still very segregated. Um, so, but he and his siblings all were graduated either valedictorian or salutatorian. And so, being African American in Chicago, if you said Duster, people were like, "Oh, I know your mom." It's like, well, that's not my mom, but it's my aunt. If you tell her, it'll get to my mom.
Yeah.
So again, the name recognition and accountability and high standards really came from the name Duster, which, according to my aunt, that the Duster name would not have been as prevalent without Alfreda being the descendant of Ida B. Wells and the values that Alfreda, Ida's
Yeah.
daughter, brought into that union. And so some of those values, so going back to how did it influence me, I would say not much as a descendant that I intentionally received as a
Sure.
descendant of Ida B. Wells until probably college or afterwards, where I started to read more about her. And then I was asked to do some speeches about her, for graduations and so forth. And that's when I really realized, like, wow, she's awesome. As with a lot of people in our history, we know
Yeah.
the 2 or 3 sentences that people talk about, and I knew a little bit more than that, but it wasn't until after college where I really read her autobiography that my grandmother produced or edited from Ida's journal. And that
Oh,
was,
wow.
yeah, so that was, a challenge to get published as well, which is another story for a different day. But that's when I became more aware of Ida and really was like, wow, she's a phenomenal woman. She's a phenomenal figure in our history who happens to be an African American woman.
Yeah. I mean, and it also says a lot about, look, connecting to it or connecting the dots more directly, and then now owning that history. You think about Alfreda and you think about really the legacy that she created, and when you talk about the values that she instilled in your family, that obviously comes from your great grandmother. But I love that. So it's not like, I think for you just growing up, it's like, well, that's our family and this is what we learned from our family and this is how we roll. Um, but then to connect to it as a young adult, in your 20s, in college and in your 20s, I think that's kind of where people begin to solidify their calling, right? Like, I think you were called to also help people understand history, but also to do something great for yourself. So thank you so much for all that history. And I agree with you on Chicago. I think you and I are around the same age. I remember the first time I ever spent some social time in Chicago. I was born and raised in Southern California in East LA. And then we moved to the suburbs for public education because it was really bad in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
And I remember going to Chicago for the first time, like right after I graduated from school. And I thought, oh, I had this glamorous view of how diverse the city would be. And it was, depending on what neighborhood that you were hanging out in. I had no idea how segregated it was. And so that was just another lesson in my own young adult life of like, wow, this is everywhere. And while you might be in a certain community and see diversity and a certain kind of culture all around you, doesn't mean everyone's integrating or mixing together. And it's just a reminder of like even travel's good education, depending on where you are in the country. So in Chicago, have you remained in Chicago the entire time? Has that been home base for you? Or
So
have you?
I spent
Yeah.
about 5 years in the DC area.
Okay.
I had a job with Coca-Cola, and they hired me in Chicago and said, there is no position for you here. There will be no position for you here. You can interview as thing. I mean, that was their business model. So I interviewed in Atlanta, didn't get that. Interviewed in the DC area and got that. So my home was in Arlington, Virginia. My office was in Columbia, Maryland. But
Nice.
I came back here in '01 to start my own business doing motivational speaking and coaching.
Love it. And actually, that's legend too. To get hired by, at that time when you got the job, Coca-Cola is a big brand and they've been known for hiring really great sales and marketing people. And so I'm not surprised having been hired from them and living in the DMV area and then bringing it back. And then you became an entrepreneur yourself. So let's talk about that. So, how did you parlay all this amazing experience? And what was that decision factor to go, I'm going to go back and like do my own business, do motivational speaking? Say more about that.
Sure. So my advice on being an entrepreneur is do as I say, not as I did. So I've been entrepreneurial pretty much all my life. I used to buy fireworks in Indiana and come back here and sell them to the neighborhood kids and unbundle them and sell them individually and so forth. Um, but yeah, so my degree was in finance, so I thought that's what I was going to do, and I did an internship in sales with IBM and fell in love with that. So I went from there. They went through a resizing and offered me money to leave, and I'm like, what?
What? Yeah.
What? Okay. So I'd never taken longer than a week vacation. I'd always had internships or whatever. So I never taken longer than a week vacation in my life. So I was like, cool, I'll take the money, take a vacation. I know I can get another job. So interviewed, got a job with Abbott Diagnostics, and that I worked out of my home. So I've worked out of my home pretty much since '92.
Oh, wow.
An experience is that when you're young, it's like, oh, you're working at the home, I'm coming through. It's like, no,
Yeah.
I'm working. I happen to be at home. So an education for both me and my friends on how to establish those boundaries. Um, and I actually was part owner of a coffee shop here in Chicago. So that was my, I say, first biggest entrepreneurial venture. It was supposed to be a cyber cafe. We did the business plan, and this is back in '95, '96 when AOL was charging uh,
Right.
$25 a month for internet for 8 hours, and it was like $8 an hour or something. And so our profit center was supposed to be the internet portion of it for people to pay for it, and we're going to train people how to use the internet. And just technology and the pricing changed so dramatically in those 2 years. We went out of business, and we only got about half of what we wanted to open the shop, which is it's just enough to fail.
Yeah.
So lessons learned there is stick with the business. If you do business plans, if you don't get what you want, pretty much stick with it. We went and retooled it with our hearts instead of our heads.
Yeah.
And so, but I've always wanted to do entrepreneurial things. And as far as being a motivational speaker, I listen to, of course, Les Brown, Anthony Robbins, Brian Tracy, a lot of other folks. And there was a guy by the name of Keith Harrell who used to come to the IBM classes in '89 and '90. And he was a sales rep, but came and did a pep talk, if you will. And
Hmm.
he's talking about being super fantastic and attitude is everything, and just made an impact on me. And so I read an article about him in probably '98 in the Wall Street Journal, and he was officially a motivational speaker and had increased his fees from 6,000 to 8,000 and was booked like 18 to 24 months out. And going back to um, you, so flipping it from a negative to a positive, say you can't be what you can't see, which we
Yeah.
especially talk about with African Americans, is that if you see it and you see somebody that can do it, you believe you can do it. So I'd say that was the first time where I'd always thought about doing motivational speaking, but with him doing that, and again, he'd take my phone calls. So he was not my homie, but
Okay.
he knew me, right? So I don't want to misrepresent. Um, but that gave me the confidence to start doing something. And then I was a sales coach for Verizon in their call center, and I really just did a phenomenal job there. And it was less about me teaching about sales, more me teaching about motivation and hey, what's in it for them, and just giving confidence to try something new. And that gave me the confidence to start my own business. So I'd walked away from a six-figure job before then. and then moved back to Chicago after that. And I moved back to Chicago just before 9/11,
Oh, geez.
um, which so I had some contracts that I was working on, and they were just like, "Sorry, dude, we're not doing anything."
Right.
So, and then, so beginning, that was end of 2001, beginning of 2002, I tore my Achilles tendon. And I was back at home with my parents. I thought I'd be back here for a few months, and ended up being longer than that, which is a blessing. I got to spend more. I get along with my parents. A lot of people didn't. So my dad was definitely one of my best friends, as was my mom. But those are different relationships.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, was like, man, if I'm going to struggle, let me struggle doing what I want. So I got some certifications in NLP, which neuro linguistic programming,
Hmm.
um, strategic planning, facilitation, restorative justice, um, anti-sexual harassment, diversity training. And so did a number of things over the years. It was like people would say, "Can you do this?" And be like, "Yeah, I can do that."
Yeah.
Well,
Let me go get certified.
get your
Right. Let me get it
get
together.
your
Right.
certification
Amazing.
and do it. So yeah, so I've done a number of things over the years.
I
I've
love
done
it.
financial literacy training and what I call wealthy mindset coaching since 2004. I was with an organization that did a lot of work in the community, um, and Action for Children, really targeting early childhood education, which another conversation on the importance of that. Um, but yeah, so right now that's I
Amazing.
still do a number of things, but yeah, the as far as keynotes and workshops, I've done ethics training, I've done communication skills training, leadership development, and strategic planning, and I've done that for organizations, and then I've done it for individuals as well because it's the same
Sure.
process. Hey, what do you want to do in the next whatever 3 to 5, 7 years? What does it look like? And so,
I love
long
that.
answer to your question, but yeah, I've done a lot of things, and some out of passion, some out of necessity, and some out of necessity that turned into a passion.
I love that. I love that you actually honed in on what your calling is and what called you to do that. But I also want to jump into, I always ask my guests their definition of culture. And I'm finding your definition of culture and just in how you were talking about the initial training that you were doing, as well as being a motivational speaker. So tell me, when I say the word culture, like how would you define it in the context of culture?
So I think culture is a difficult word to actually define. An example would be, and I just happened to see it recently. I'm sure once I agreed to do this, then you become more
Yeah.
aware. But there's um, a and if somebody just happened to send it to me, I didn't solicit it. But Denzel Washington talking about directing, being an African American director, and he used because the person was like, well, can't a white person have directed this? He's like,
Hmm.
it's really about culture. He's like, you got Martin Scorsese, who's got his culture that he brings to it. You've got to I guess Goodfellas or The Godfather. I can't
The
remember which one. The
Godfather.
Godfather.
Yeah.
Right. He's going. You've got Steven Spielberg, who directed Schindler's List, and so they bring a cultural element to it that I couldn't. So
Yeah.
I think so in trying to explain culture, it's um, who you are as a person and who you are as a people. What does that represent? And so you can talk about race, culture, and identity. Is that what is your cultural identity? And that's tied to who you are. That combines, I think, race, identity, and values. So
I love that definition. And actually, that's so eloquently put. I was having this conversation, and I think you got to know him. He actually also attended our gathering in Washington, D.C. Derek Lunston, he's a CEO and well, actually, he's the chief culture officer of Life Guides. And he actually was so passionate about everyone coming together. He also attended Washington, D.C. with us. And I had him as a guest here on CultureCast. And I think the unlocked conversation, which you're reminding me of now, is really culture is about who you are. It starts with an individual. In order for someone to become a leader or influencer in a community, or in a organization, right? The culture of that community, the culture of that organization, it really starts with the individual. When you're telling stories about, you know, Ms. Wells Barnett, right? You're talking about your great grandmother and how people were just hating on her. And what I mean by that is like, she's sitting in the ladies' car, for example, well dressed woman put together. It wasn't about her, it was about them, right? It's like the culture you carry, the culture that you create is who you are. And it's for good and not for good, right? And it's all in how you treat yourself and how you respect yourself, and therefore how you respect others. And I think the other piece that I was kind of listening, which kind of reminds me of management philosophy, culture philosophy as well, is you were talking about being an early trainer in Verizon, right? And teaching in these call centers and how it's about inspiring confidence, right? You talked about motivation, really is tied to confidence. And, I'm going to say this and would love for you to kind of react to my pickup on culture and motivation. I think the role that leaders play, I think the first responsibility they have, both as a leader responsible for people, as well as a leader responsible for creating culture, is that it is about inspiring confidence in other individuals, one by one, that you believe in who they are, right? And when you do, that just engenders confidence, increases confidence in them so that when they show up, and these days, whether it's virtually or in person, that they bring it all, right? And by bringing it all, you can also have these amazing ideas that we may have missed out on, good or bad, because they're feeling the confidence to bring it all. So, what are your reactions to that? I'm getting all of that from what you just said.
Sure. No,
Yeah.
I totally agree. And again, if you invited Derek, shout out and thank you to you. That was a reconnection. I met Derek probably 7 or 8 years
No
ago.
way. No, you
Yeah.
didn't.
When because he had another company at that point when I can't recall
Yeah.
the name of it. But he was like, Derek, it took us like probably 30 minutes between saying hello and then like reconnecting. Like, hey, were you at this conference? We met. So yeah, just a really good guy. But yeah, going back to culture and leadership and inspiration is, yeah, all that's necessary. That's one of the things that I did at Verizon, and I created the foundation of my company, which I said there are three aspects to training, which is the task, which most people focus on, whether it's, hey, how do you type faster? How do you sell more? How do
Yeah.
you do this? But the individual is, hey, what's in it for them? And how do you help that individual? And then lastly is and equally or more important is the environment. Is, are you creating an environment that facilitates and cultivates the safe environment for change, which
Yeah.
speaks to your thing about how do you get, if you admonish somebody, discipline somebody for making an attempt to change, that's not going to give them any confidence. So
Yep.
you give them that environment to try something new and be confident and gain confidence, right? Because you're not going to be confident the first time you do something. So
Sure.
the environment to gain confidence is what's important. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that. That's part of the culture of an organization or a community is that safety that's there and
Yeah.
support and creating that environment that can create and sustain confidence.
Oh my gosh, that's such good advice. I always ask people what great advice can you give others who are listening to this, watching this. And I love how you kind of pointed out, first of all, what's in it for them. It's about the individual, understanding, like tying it back to them. And then, of course, the confidence piece, but then the environment, the psychological safety, the environment that you create for people so that learning can occur, and you could
Mhm.
learn. And learning might entail failure, right? It might entail you're trying something new and you're right, you're building the confidence. So I love that advice. Now, when you and I connected after Washington, D.C., we were talking about a few things that you're doing in the name of Ida B. Wells and an idea that you had. I think there's this Memorial Foundation, but you also talked about some kind of leadership institute. Say more about like, all right, you're creating your legacy, like, and with your experience and your passion for where you came from, but say more about like what are you working on now to continue your legacy and your family's legacy?
Sure. So my dad's generation started the Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation in the late
Okay.
80s. Really as a way, people would say, hey, I want to help out, I want to contribute. How to do so? Like, okay, well, let's do not for profit. So it's a foundation, which of course can receive funds. A lot of people think that we give money or we get calls. It's like, no, we pretty much receive money, and then our main thing right now, my sister and I and another cousin or two kind of took the reins over in the late you know 2000s or early 20 teens and started doing scholarships at Russ College, which is her Ida's alma mater in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And so we've been doing that now for this will be year number 15.
Oh, wow.
Um, and the tuition there is only about 6 grand, and it used to be $1,000 scholarships to each of 3 students. Now we've expanded it because we've gotten a little more funding, so 1,500 for 4 students. So that's significant. About a fourth of their tuition. So that's the foundation. We still do things to promote, protect Ida's legacy. And one thing that I've done, if I do speeches on Ida, one of them being "Make Your Legacy Matter,"
Okay.
um, which talks about everybody's got a legacy. It's how do you leave the legacy that you want, and we've got to be purposeful about that. I've had clients say, "Well, I have kids, I don't have much money, so I don't have a legacy." It's like, no, each and every one of us has a legacy. Each and every one of you
I
listening out there,
agree.
you've got a legacy. It's
Right.
what legacy, what impact do you want to leave? What mark do you want to make in your community, in the world? Um, and so that's important. So again, I've done a leadership development program, or what I call life readiness program, which really encompasses character education, leadership development for high school students, and brought it down to grade school students. I've done that off and on since '92. Haven't done it in a few years. Just funding for it is tough. So
Hmm.
um, I did meet a guy last year, yeah, a year and a half ago, that may have some funding to do it. So ideally, I'd love to start the IDB Wells Leadership Institute
Okay.
and have different have the programming distinctly targeted for grade school, high school, college, and professional. Is that some of the values are absolutely the same, which another speech that I do would encompass at least half of the values, which is be wells, which is be wise with your choices, be excellent with your actions, live with integrity, lead with courage, and speak with passion. And those are things that she did. Is she made all of her choices wise, and not just about her. Like I said, she expanded any major problem that she experienced. She took it from her to her
Yeah.
community, right? So the train incident, she didn't go back and fight the conductor again. She sued the railroad,
Right.
right? For the boycott, in Memphis, she didn't, fight with. She did a boycott. So to really think about what you're doing and be wise with your choices, and know that you've always got choice. To do something, not to do something, there's usually at least a third choice in there. Um, so to be excellent with your actions. When you look at Ida's writing, she was outstanding and really did her best, and that's a trait that was passed down to us: is do your best. Right? You can't be the best, but you can always do your best.
Yeah.
So whatever you do your best at it. You're doing it anyway. Give it that little extra effort, and make it great versus good, or at least the effort great. And I know your limitations. There's some things that I can't do. I've got a great voice. You don't want to hear me sing. I can bop it, right. So there's but whatever it is, do your best. Um, live with integrity is knowing what's right and doing what's right, even if you don't feel like it, and even if
Hmm.
nobody's looking. And something that I talk to especially youth about all the time. The other component of the integrity is doing your best and giving the best in order to get the best. Is, to me, that's part of life's equations. You can't expect the best out of life if you're not giving the best to go into it. So
Totally.
you got to do your best and give your best in order to get the best. Um, and then to go along with it is live with courage. To have true integrity, which means doing the right thing or doing what you feel is right, means you're going to have to tell some people no. You're going to have to irritate some people. You're going to
Yeah.
have to piss some people off, right?
Right.
And you have to have the courage to do that, to stand your ground. And that's what I talk about in leadership. We often consider leadership as the ability to lead others, which is definitely part of it. But it starts with the ability to stand on your own and say, here's my
Hmm.
values, here's what I'm sticking to. And that takes a tremendous amount of courage to do that, which I had experienced, any civil rights leader has experienced, in that you don't start off with a crowd cheering and saying, yes, this is it. You start off with people saying, hey, fool, I don't agree with that.
Yeah,
And you've
right,
got to overcome that. And then the last part of that, like I said, is speak with passion. In order to speak with passion, you have to have passion. So find what you're passionate about,
right.
whatever that is. I see programs all the time about somebody started this foundation, this center based on whatever. Unfortunately, a lot of it can start from grief. Mothers losing sons to drunk driving. MAD is one of the biggest organizations and most influential organizations that started from mothers who lost their
Yeah.
lives to grieving. So find your passion. Again, mine is absolutely helping others and achieving their potential. But whatever that passion is, and you'll find your following. Just a quick snippet on that. There was a guy talking about streaming services, and an interperson was interviewing. It's like, well, you know, with the networks, again, back when we were growing up, you had
Yeah.
four choices, right? Maybe
Yep.
five, including WGN, and so you had to appeal to a certain amount of viewers in order to have a show that is sustainable. Whereas right now, you've got so many streaming services, you can have
Yeah.
one segment that you appeal to, and you'll be successful, and you'll make a huge impact within that segment. So find your passion, and you'll find a following that's going to make that you'll make an impact.
Oh my goodness. All of this is actually, again, it starts with the work and the legacy you want to create in life, or even the influence that you want to make in the life around you in a culture. It really does start with you. And I love this be wells. Be wise, be excellent at what you do, live with integrity, and in order to do your best, in order to get the best, live with courage and speak with passion. Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
that is so easy to live by and to actually, and that applies in terms of culture. And then I love this idea of a leadership institute too. And I know you and I talked about this after we connected from Washington, D.C. And I love that it's starting in grade school because I think it's that very formative time that as adults we get our baggage from, right? You think about like that stuff that we live with that holds us down might be because it's what we experienced or something. And I know this is not a psychology session, but I think about like in my own career development, that it was recognizing those things growing up that I'm like, oh, that's getting in my way, right? And to have that acronym, I think, to stand by and teach that young, I think goes a really long way. So I love that. Um, so tell
Thank
us
you.
about what help you need, to get this Leadership Institute continue to be rolling.
Oh wow, great question. I'd say the main thing um, would be funding.
Okay.
If I could get the funding, I've got enough connections to at least do something for the grade school and high school. The college and professional, I think I could do a decent amount to cultivate my own network there. But yeah, funding in order to do it is, and again, that's the challenge, is sustainable funding, right? And that
Yeah.
the challenge with funding, and again, fortunately, IDB Wells Memorial Foundation, we don't need much funding, but I've got friends who've got not-for-profits, and every year it's like, okay, are we going to keep our doors open? We got a grant for 3 years, so we know we're good
Yeah.
for 3 years. But to have sustainable funding to say, I'm good for 10 years, the impact that I can make would be huge. Humbly,
Yeah.
I know it would be huge.
I think that and also the right partnerships, right? That from a corporate standpoint, if you think about you've got the grade school and high school covered, but then to take that into the professional setting, I think there's also ways that you can scale what it is that you're doing, not only through the funding, but maybe even forging some partnerships. Because there's, I think, some very successful small but mighty organizations out there really getting it done in terms of like creating um, learning and leadership development around building inclusive cultures. I'll just say that broadly, or equitable cultures. And I think there's a way that you can associate with that, as you are gaining funding and just getting traction on expanding.
I received that, and I owe you a check for. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, and I will
Well,
do that.
yeah, I love that. And also, I'm going back to, you're talking about your Be Wells kind of framework. And, you're talking about legacy and how everyone has a legacy. And it's not about how much money you're going to leave for your family. It really is about getting really clear about what you're passionate about, and then living that. And once you do physically leave this earth, it is about how are people going to remember you, right?
Hmm.
And I love this philosophy that you shared. It's like, in order to get the best, you need to give the best. And it's consistent with a philosophy that I love too, which is like you get what you give in life, right? And if it's all goodness and positive vibes and wanting to help people, that while it may not come back around right away, it will come back to you, right? And I think about the connections that you're talking about. Those connections at some point will be super valuable depending on, what's happening in life. So yeah. And what is the best way for everyone to get a hold of you once we post this in the show notes? What's the best way if they want to get involved, they want to connect with you directly? Um, we'll also post this in the notes, but what's the best way, Dan?
Sure. So easiest thing would be go to danduster.com, and I
Nice.
will need to, yeah. So danduster.com. Um, or just yeah, I'll put my Gmail out there, which is dandusterspeaks@gmail.com. If you want to do something immediate, but yeah, so I need to go to danduster.com, make sure I've got the information form. I'm easy to get a hold of if you reach out to me, if you Google, I'm on LinkedIn or whatever, but
Oh, great. Yeah.
Dan Duster speaks at gmail.com or danduster.com.
Right on. Yeah, danduster.com, dandusterspeaks at gmail.com. They can also link up with you on LinkedIn. Pretty
Hmm.
amazing. I always like to ask like a fun culture question before we wrap. And hopefully you got a heads up on this, but if not, it's super easy. So I love pop culture, right? Like, what are all the things that people are into, which creates pop culture? So, what are you loving these days in terms of eating, reading, watching, listening to? What are you into these days?
So funny you should ask it, because I did read the question that said you were going to do that, and I said I'd wait and see what comes to mind, because I don't have so I'm not a foodie per se. I enjoy food, of course, um, but I'd say for me it's really getting back into healthy soul food.
Okay.
Um, right, 'cause I love soul food, and unfortunately, some of the best soul food restaurants in Chicago have closed. The original owner died, and there was no succession plan. Um, but I'm really getting back to enjoying that. And one thing that I'm literally going to start doing, I just had a meeting with an old friend yesterday, is to have periodic meetings with friends. And being purposeful about it. So
Yeah.
I've done what I call meaningful meetings, one on one with friends. And unfortunately, I did that as a result of people passing away and me going to their services
Yeah.
and being like, "Wow, I didn't know they did that. I didn't know they did
Yeah.
that." Like, you know what? If there's an easy way for me to find out, call them up and say, "Let's do lunch." And so I've done that one on one, but I'm going to start doing with small to medium groups. In that I'm blessed to be connected to some wonderful people, and to me, I know it's part of my responsibility to make those connections with others. Right? Is that when you connect good people with good people, great things happen. So
Totally agree.
that's part of the culture, is to share the culture of just good people. Again, like I said, as we talked earlier, culture can have different definitions, and in this community that I'm trying to cultivate, it's really about good people, good energy, and it's independent of your profession or your passions or whatever. Just, hey, good people, let's get together and enjoy each other's company, and hopefully make some new connections.
Well, I love it. I think it's totally why there was such an affinity when I met you. I mean, I think about my own calling, and it is about profoundly and joyfully connecting people to one another in service to creating opportunity, period. And like, it's a joy to do that. But it's also profound when you bring people together. I agree with you. You bring good people together and great things happen as a result of it. So right on that. And then, yeah, I'm going to want to know your list once you figure out where all the healthy soul food and, that hopefully coming back, into the neighborhoods and the community where you live. That sounds amazing. Like we want to know. Hungry
Okay.
minds want to know. Hungry appetites. Yeah,
So
amazing.
we'll see. That's another thing I want to do, and I'll speak it into existence is develop a network for Black businesses and or those that positively serve the Black community. Is that oftentimes I think, especially as African Americans supporting Black businesses, there may be a sense of compromise. Like, oh, I know the service is not going to be as
Yeah,
good, and I really want to eliminate that. So I've got the site which I need to cultivate, but it's qualityblackbiz.com. And so that I just thought about saying that right now. So you can be my
great.
accountability partner and whoever else out there. Is that I'd really like to launch that and be able to support, the culture of Black businesses and those that positively support the Black community. Because just because you're a Black business does not mean that you're supporting the Black community, and
Yeah.
because you're not doesn't mean that you can't or you're not. So um, that's one thing that a legacy that I'd like to leave as well is being able to better support communities or businesses in our community.
I love it. I think it's just a through line for you. Your legacy out there is about spreading goodness, whether it's one on one, inspiring confidence in others to have a motivation to go do their thing, and then just supporting success in others. So I don't know how else to leave it other than you're amazing. And thank you
Oh,
so much for
well,
like
thank
joining
you.
me on this conversation. And
No,
thanks so much too for the insight on your great grandmother. It's really cool to hear the stories from your perspective. Based, I know it's all history, but hearing it from the
oh,
OG of the OG is amazing.
by all means, my pleasure. And Marissa, you were absolutely amazing. Thank you for what you do. Please keep doing it. I can't believe an hour has gone this quickly. It's catching up with an old friend. So I appreciate you.
Exactly. I
Thank
love
you.
it. I appreciate you and everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I think the name Duster, of course, will sound familiar, not only if you're from the Chicago area, but then Michelle Duster, we had to reschedule for technical difficulties. That won't be until June 24th. So hopefully you can all join us then. And then we've got some other amazing guests coming up next month in May, which I will post about on LinkedIn. Until then, everyone, please reach out to Dan. We'll put this in the show notes again, danduster.com, dandusterspeaks@gmail.com. We'll also highlight your new business. And until then, until we meet again, Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Marissa. Thanks,
All
everybody.
right.
Have a wonderful week. All right.
Be well. Take care, all.
You